Thank you. It's a pleasure being here, and thank you, Mike. I'm going to jump right in, and is it too loud? I feel like I'm in an echo chamber, but it may be just my ears not working properly. Can you hear me in the back, or is it right? Okay. So I'm going to present probably a dozen or so projects, and they're going to range in both type and scale from buildings to exhibitions to speculative projects to interior projects. And for us, the diversity of the work we like to believe is underpinned by consistent thinking that tries to take the restrictions or the problems or the difficulties of each project, take them very seriously, take the constraints seriously, and try to kind of twist them into the generative part of the project. In other words, it's often the kind of constraints that actually give a project idiosyncrasy, give it specificity, and we like to kind of approach it by asking what we call what-if questions, questions that are seeking to find opportunistic overlaps between material, form, budget, space, et cetera, all in service of a kind of an optimistic, ultimately, architecture that's curious about what could happen, how things could be deployed, and how they could affect the lives of those experiencing it. And I'll start with a series of restaurants that we did in New York City. And these are all kind of defined by a similar restriction in that inevitably you have too little space. They're all quite small, from 200 square feet to the maximum, which is about maybe 2,000 square feet. But the floor plan really ends up being defined by efficiency. You have to kind of maximize profit for the owner. You've got to get the seating to be as dense as possible. It's got to work very well from the flow of the kitchen out and so forth. So in a sense, the architectural invention or the kind of way in which you have to kind of focus your energy often gets deployed not in plan, but in terms of the materialization of the walls and the ceilings. In other words, the kind of wrapper, the enclosure. So specifically with Fluff Bakery, you end up almost having to have a split personality. You have to have this kind of efficient, logical plan, and then you we tried to develop a kind of much more curious, speculative, and seductive approach to the surface. And specific with Fluff Bakery, we imagined how one could start to coat the walls and the ceilings of a space in about 5 miles of 3/4-inch thick industrial felt and stained Baltic birch plywood that was ripped into strips of 3/4-inch. And this would be stacked up very much like brick. And it ended up producing a kind of an interesting surface that in our mind did a number of things. It produced what we call the kind of multivalent performance, that the surface would both be the back, the kind of padding, if you will, for the banquettes. It would produce an acoustic environment. There's a kind of great quality to the sound in here, given the way in which the felt would operate. But it also had an interesting optical consequence in that you almost had a kind of paradoxical shift between the view and perspective, which induced almost a sense of velocity, a kind of horizontal vertigo. But in elevation, it affected a kind of calm. That what you see here is a flattening of the walls and the ceiling. The speaker actually registers the difference between the wall and the ceiling. But so on the one hand, you get this velocity, and you also get this calm affected or produced by the same material. Working as a kind of counterpoint to the excessive linearity of the felt strips, we developed a custom branching chandelier that kind of spread across the space. And this was all made out of 8-foot lengths of conduit that were bent into 3 different shapes and then accumulated to produce this kind of random dispersal of linear lights throughout the reflected ceiling plan and throughout the space. And here a view from the sidewalk, trying to make sure that the architecture itself becomes the signage, becomes the seduction, and the fact that there's coincidence with the image of going into hyperspace in Star Wars was very much something we wanted to do. I mean, again, trying to make the architecture do as much as possible simultaneously. The next project, Zing Restaurant, is really defined by the nature of a tenement building in New York. Namely, you have these kind of pinches in on the 2 sides where the light wells would come down. And so rather than trying to produce the image of a continuous space that, that would somehow be believable back to front, we actually went the opposite direction and said, well, all right, what would happen if we actually cut the space up and divide it into segments? And part of our inspiration for this was the logic of the surrealist game of the exquisite corpse, which I'm sure many of you have done. You know, you fold a piece of paper, one person draws the feet, and the next person draws the legs, torso, head, and so forth, and you unfold the figure, and based on the continuity of the lines that are used to produce the connection between the parts, you end up with this kind of grotesque figure as a result. And we were very interested in, could we do an equivalent thing within an architectural space? And so what we did is imagine that we would move from the front of the space to the back and into a series of segments that would also follow the logic of moving from public, where we would deploy stone, to the middle ground of bamboo, then acrylic, and then finally at the back, where it was more intimate, we had a room full of velvet, basically. So one has a transition that matches the movement from public to private, and also from a kind of hard to soft materials. And from the storefront, again, much like fluff, we wanted the architecture to appear to almost be visible in section. And here you see the various layers from the acrylic to the bamboo and into the velvet. And the connective tissue that was deployed throughout this, much like the lines of the exquisite corpse game, were these kind of connections of materials. So here, moving from the acrylic wrap of the bamboo area to a kind of light canopy that then folds down and connects to the bar. And where it's in the enclosure for the bathrooms, the acrylic actually is the bathroom doors, giving you kind of glimpses of people inside the bathrooms, which is an obligation in New York restaurants. You have to make something seductive and titillating within the context of the bathroom. And finally, moving to the back of the space, thinking about the back of the back room really almost as if it was a piece of furniture, a large banquette that one can nest in for more intimate and private conversations. The next restaurant, Tides, was a space that was actually higher than it was wide. So our worry here was trying to find a way to avoid kind of feelings of claustrophobia. And the thought was, could we actually make the ceiling actually a site of distraction, a site of distraction from that potential claustrophobia? And so we started looking at the materials that they were going to be using within the kitchen. We often kind of play around with, just looking at everyday things and starting to kind of imagine how they might be accumulated to other ends. So we acquired about 110,000 of these bamboo skewers and inserted them into drop ceiling panels, and then basically placed them into the ceiling. And the cumulative effect of this really produced a kind of topographic underworld, if you will. And it really, I think, was very effective at kind of taking, providing a sense of almost, I wouldn't call it monumentality, but a kind of sense of spectacle within this incredibly constrained space. Bamboo was deployed everywhere within the space, so tables were made out of bamboo, and even the banquette was another form of bamboo, different colors of bamboo. So trying to find a way that we work with a single material and start to kind of tease it out in a variety of different configuration and effects. The last of the restaurants that I'll present is Dash Dogs, and it was by far the smallest. It was about 220 square feet. And by the time we positioned the kitchen back here, and we ended up having a very small space left over. And the thought was to actually formalize the act of getting a hot dog and eating it. So the plan literally is in one door, look at a hot dog, buy the hot dog, go to the counter, eat the hot dog, and then leave. And I think the client very much liked this because they imagined that they would just get lines of people going right from the sidewalk in, eating hot dogs and out. Fortunately, their hot dogs didn't live up to their desires. But so the other thing that we wanted to do with this project is to actually push it in a counterintuitive direction. And so what we told the client is that we actually wanted to make their small space actually even smaller. We're going to raise the floor by about 6 inches, drop the ceiling about 2 feet, 2'6", so that we could actually move from something that would look like this, and through the logic of force perspective, end up with this as a kind of consequence. And that's, seemed to make sense to us. We were very kind of fascinated by trying to make a small space smaller and give it the appearance of being larger. And the way we sold it to the client is we said, look, when somebody gets to the counter, your hot dog will actually appear bigger. And it was a very convincing argument. But in all seriousness, one of the important things for us is to move from what often is a kind of one-liner initiation of a project, and to then start to see the ripple effects or the kind of elaboration of that idea out into other kind of qualities and details. So for us, we took the steel cladding of the floor, the wall, and the ceiling, and actually had it follow again, the logic of forced perspective. So the planks were 6-inch wide at the street, and as you work your way back, they moved to 4-inch, 3 inches, and then 2-inch, so that the very cadence of the material reiterated that forced perspective. And every other plank was gapped so that we would get a dotted line, essentially registering the difference between desire and consumption down the middle of the space. The bamboo counter was actually cantilevered from the outside of the space, part of that idea of trying to bring people in from the sidewalk and bring them in. So the counter actually started outside, cantilevered into the space, registering again that difference between the two sides. And given the fact that it was the only thing level in the space and the floor was constantly sloping, anywhere along the length of the bar, somebody at any variety of height could find a comfortable place to eat their hot dog. And just a final detail, because we became very obsessed with kind of carrying through this sequential spatial articulation of the forced perspective. Even the gaps within the steel structure actually match the gaps within the floor. I don't think anybody who went in there noticed that, but it was very important to us that you try at every detail and elaboration to amplify and intensify an idea that might have started off simply as a one-liner. This is a project Mike mentioned in the introduction, which is an installation that we did at the American Pavilion in the 2004 Venice Biennale. And we were asked by Architecture Record, who curated the exhibition, to be one of six kind of younger firms. Each firm was asked to rethink a particular American prototype. We were asked to rethink a parking structure. And we were given kind of assigned locations within the American Pavilion. And at first glance, we were actually excited because we were up front and center. And then we quickly realized by looking at the photographs that this was our space. And we were, as I'll show, we do a lot of drawings, we do models, and we were very excited to show all those. And then we had to confront the reality that we had a space that essentially wasn't very conducive to exhibiting drawings and models. You couldn't put a screw or make any marks or damage anything of the existing courtyard, and of course it's not protected from the weather. So we started to say, all right, well, how can we actually twist this into our advantage? Could we take the actual column and the kind of slope of the column and actually pull it out into the space of the courtyard, using the column as an anchor for a cantilever aluminum armature, which will then wrap in an exterior grade image banner. And what this allowed us to do is move from a series of 4 frontal columns and essentially split them into a series of corridors, or in other words, move from frontal columns and essentially cut them in half. So they have a left side and a right side. And that on the left side of each of these banners, we would locate a series of analysis of the problems and pleasures of parking and plan. And on the right-hand side of these banners were located a series, 3 of our projects that were dealing with the possibilities and potentials of parking when thought through section. We had a 4th side that we had to contend with. One of the problems about developing a kind of serial exhibition is you actually have to do all the sides, and we didn't have a 4th project. And we were at the time talking with a number of different companies who might be willing to donate some money to allow us to kind of make this project possible. And we got in touch with the Car Freshener Corporation, which hopefully you all recognize. You may have never looked at these closely. These are amazing devices. Or objects, if you will. They're an incredible variety of colors, languages, smells. The smell of black ice, new car, of course, lavender, Portuguese sport. It's just incredible variation. And the problem with these, they've acquired a bad reputation because people don't use them right. So if you get one of these things, you're supposed to use the sleeve to release the odor sequentially by pulling down one branch at a time. So if you just yank off the cover, it'll stink to high hell. So just, word of advice, they're wonderfully designed. The packaging is part of the release of the odor. Anyways, the Air Freshener Corporation gave us about 2,700 of these things. And we started to kind of accumulate them on that fourth banner, much like one would do a mosaic. But in our particular case, we ended up imaging a 1971 VW Bug in cross-section. You can see the steering wheel, the seats, the wheels here, and imaging it at full scale. And we really enjoyed the fact that in the context of Venice, we were able to kind of image an automobile at the resolution of an air freshener pixel. And a final detail, you can see that one of them is missing. By the end of the exhibition, they were all stolen, which I think, if somebody is stealing things in an exhibition, then you're doing something right. So, okay. So the project we developed for this exhibition was called Park Tower. And what we wanted to do here is combine two different sets of things. One was combining an architectural cliche of the continuous ramping floor. I'm sure most of you out there have tried to do a project with a continuous ramping floor. We really wanted to do the continuous surface, but combine it with a new technology, or I should say, a technology that was newly available to consumers in the form of electric and hydrogen vehicles. And we also wanted to combine the suburban desire of parking with close proximity to program with an urban footprint. Namely, could we develop a drive-up skyscraper? A skyscraper that would be an intertwining of 35 stories of parking and 35 stories of program. And that the tower, as a mixed-use tower, would then be organized according to the logics of ratios of parking. So that the retail, which requires the most amount of parking per square foot of interior program, would be located at the lower level, hotel the next up, office, and then finally housing, which requires the least amount of parking per square foot relative to interior program, would be located at the top. And moving through the cross-section here, one moves from the kind of retail at the lower level, through the hotel, through the office, and then finally at the residential at top. The other thing I should point out here, in addition to the interlacing of the program and parking, there's a series of express ramps double stacked for up and down, so that one can move from the top of the building to the bottom of the building much more rapidly, similar to the way in which express trains work in cities. Moving through this a little bit more slowly, this is the retail level, and the strategy here is to take the strip mall and to basically wrap it around itself. And every parking spot is a good parking spot, a close proximity to program, and the act of getting from the car to the program now isn't simply walking across the fields of parking, but actually produces a kind of collective space, a kind of an atrium, a social, more socially conducive space in the interstice between those two points of destination. The hotel level had a similar pairing of programs where we were looking at combining the kind of lower level inexpensive motel with the more spectacular Portman-like atrium hotel. And so quite literally one here wraps a series of motel rooms where you can park immediately below your room, but the effect of that pulling around is a much more kind of seductive atrium hotel, complete with the express ramp flying through the middle of it. And even looking in these drawings, and I should say that one of the key things for us with these, this kind of drawing type is to take a kind of masked out section and then through the act of kind of drawing it and redrawing it and kind of iteratively working through it, add much more detail and believability so that we can start to imagine how even the parking garage could be the diving platform within the context of the hotel pool. And then moving up to the residential level, one would park on top of of your apartment. Each apartment has its own view out to the horizon, out to the landscape. But rather than the horizontal sprawl of suburbia, here one gets a new notion of a kind of vertical neighborhood, complete with lawns, lawn mowers, and the like, but deployed on different and we hope kind of more intriguing ways. The next project, and again, I'm intentionally skipping around because for us, we're very interested in the kind of range of work and intentionally doing a range of work. So this particular project is a 48,000 square foot dormitory that was done actually at the College of Worcester. It was done for about $145 a square foot. And it was a project that came loaded with a series of restrictions. We had to work with bricks that were consistent with the brick types on campus. We were told very explicitly we had to do a pitched roof building. One of the major problems we came up against is that when we did a program analysis of the ideal hall size for this particular small college in a small town, about 25 to 30 students made the perfect hall. It was just the right size that it wasn't too anonymous and it wasn't too isolated. But given the fact that we had to accommodate 185 beds and there was a 4-story height limit on campus, we essentially had to do 2 buildings. But, and this was the key conflict, is that the donor was very explicit about the fact that he wanted to essentially have his name on just 1 building. He didn't want a kind of collection of buildings. So that really kind of led to the diagram of the project, really 2 buildings that would kiss each other, and that the act of kind of cracking them open would produce a kind of an exterior courtyard that also had the benefit of allowing us to work with the site so that the access to an underutilized park back here could happen through the building. The building essentially became a gateway to itself and to the park beyond. And another key aspect to the project for us was finding ways within the dormitory type that we could induce as much socialization as possible. In other words, simply the act of going through the building would be coordinated to encourage chance encounters, so that the lounges were all migrated towards the front where the density of circulation would occur. Study nooks would cantilever out into this public space. The hallways were actually widened as they got towards the lounges so that the social activities that would take place in the hallways would start to merge with those that would occur in the lounges. So in a sense, the exterior of this building, this exterior courtyard, really became the heart of the project. We worked with channel glass to kind of frame and provide a kind of coherence to it, which also produced some very nice kind of transitions of light during the course of the day into night. But it also provided a kind of a much more intriguing space within what's actually a fairly difficult building type to deal with. It's relentless, it's repetitive, and so this anomaly in the middle between these 2 buildings allowed us to produce a kind of moment of kind of greater architectural excitement, if you will. Channel glass was turned at 45 degrees to allow for transparency when you're walking down the sidewalk towards the building, but it provided a veil of privacy to the students on the inside from the traffic on the street corner. And here, the view of the study nooks cantilevering out into the collective space, allowing 4 to 6 students to meet within their hall, giving them a sense of identity and presence in this more theatrical setting, being able to kind of witness the comings and goings of just daily life within the building. At the back of that moment where the buildings kiss, we stacked all the lounges so that you could be in one lounge and simply look across and see what's happening in the rest of the building. And the curtain wall here worked very well with extending the lounge into the pine tree grove that existed in that park beyond. And finally, the study nooks were really set up to, again, both provide that moment of nesting within a public space, but also providing exchanges with the adjacent study nooks, providing, again, a greater kind of possibilities of theatrics and social life within this space. And a detail that we like very much is taking the kind of monumental eyebrow of the building and letting it kind of merge into a very prosaic seat at the base of the building. So this was this is a house that was actually a house for Mark Cermaki's parents, which is a tough thing to do. And the fact that it didn't get built, I think, has more to do with the economy, but it may have actually worked out for the best. And I'm just realizing I'm being taped doing this, and so I probably shouldn't even be saying this. But anyways, It was an interesting project in that we were in a very conservative neighborhood that had a review process for design. And that review process we knew was going to be very conservative, but they only required you to submit the front elevation of our building. And we realized that the site was set up in such a way that although the kind of one of the logical ways to do the building would be to stretch it so you have a kind of a greater frontage on the street, that actually the orientation of the sun and the site and the slope of the land really meant that we should stretch the building east-west so that we'd have that kind of face towards the street. So in a sense, given the fact that we knew we only had to submit a front elevation, we decided, okay, let's not have this be a problem. Let's actually submit this as our front elevation. We felt there was no way this could be rejected on grounds of aesthetic kind of conservatism. This had to be approved. But as this pitched roof works its way back in the site, as the building is stretched east-west, or I should say west to east, we invert the pitch and it actually becomes a kind of butterfly roof and starts to open out towards the views and towards the land beyond. So one moves from the kind of compressed zone of the building where the retaining walls are pulled in, and as you move back away from the street, the retaining walls start to kind of exfoliate and turn into sunshades and start to kind of open up and capture outside spaces and make them part of the building itself. And a final model shot of the ways in which we are starting to get that connection between retaining wall landscape and the inversion of the geometry across the length of the building. Last year, we've been doing a number of projects for institutions, and we've been working closely with NYU on a couple of projects. And this was a floor plate, a very large floor plate, about 16,000 square feet, that we worked with them to renovate, where they were consolidating about 6 different departments into a single department. And since I'm speaking to a kind of an academic audience, you'll know that faculty members like to have windowed offices. So when we got the actual program of all these 6 different departments that had to be collapsed into this one floor plate and gave everybody their required window office, this was the plan that was produced. So essentially, this would be a kind of a nasty light, you know, no light would come into the inner corridors, that basically the faculty maxed out the space. So we had to kind of work long and hard with the various departments to find ways to kind of edit, reduce size, make some compromise, essentially eating away from this, this cream cheese of faculty office to kind of carve out spaces that would give a sense of kind of figural presence within the floor plan, and also simply let light in at strategic moments on the sides, at the ends of halls. And then to work through specific material delineation to give a kind of specificity within this overall floor plan. I mean, our fear was that we were going to end up with a kind of just endless hallway, repetitive office, and we needed to find a way that we could make it appear as though there are rooms within rooms or volumes within this larger volume. So the articulation of both the floor into a bench with bamboo, that same bamboo being perforated to provide a kind of ceiling cover so that one would get the sense this was actually a kind of carved space within the depth or the thickness of the building. And even on the side here, working with continuous cork that would be sloped to match the back slope of the bench. But as this wall extends down the length of the space, that actually pivots the opposite direction so that this becomes a kind of legible wall within the space, picking up on the one side the auditorium, or not really auditorium, but a kind of gathering point, and on the other side, being able to kind of capture spaces for computers and workstations at the other end, other end of this long hallway. So one moved away from the reading of it being a kind of relentless hallway, but much more now almost a kind of sculptural presence. And even looking at ways that the books could be embedded into it, so you could actually pull out faculty books and get, in a sense, start to kind of engage the architecture in particular ways. That same approach was played out within the hallway itself, where we started to perforate the walls of the faculty offices that would both kind of animate the space, but also provide a point where books that the faculty were interested in could be placed within the slot. There was also their identification, so books and IDs started to become fused in a way that we thought was appropriate for this particular department. This is actually a fairly unusual project for us, where we were asked to come into a building that was being designed by SOM and be the artist doing lobby art. And I have to admit, I tend to have I tend to have a negative reaction to lobby art because it often kind of gets placed there and kind of sits in a lifeless way. And our thought was, could we actually, and we were actually, quite honestly, we were nervous about, well, what do you do? How do you make lobby art? It just was not something that we were that familiar with. And so we started imagining, is there a way that you could actually use the act of looking at our real estate, which was this wall, and could the act of looking actually generate the very form? Could it actually produce the form of the sculpture or piece that we'd have to add? So we mapped about 270 kind of viewpoints within the lobby and then calibrated those to a series of bell curves of standard human heights. And from each of those points, we projected a cone against our real estate, a cone that when it intersected that front face would be a 6-inch diameter circle. And depending on the angle at which the view was coming from, you would get distortions, essentially ellipses would be produced on the front of this, essentially kind of an anamorphic consequence. But more interestingly, as one would pass through the thickness of our real estate, there would be much greater variation on the back side. And what we found very interesting about this is it meant that you would only ever be able to look through one particular point. There'd always be a kind of privilege point, 270 privilege points within the lobby where you get these glimpses through, and then you'd have hints that if you just moved a little bit over to the left, a little bit down, you'd be able to find that other one. So it became almost a kind of a quasi-mystery and an interest based on how these things would be passed through. The next question was, how do you materialize? How do you make this? And so we started thinking about ways that we could make this wall actually out of a series of cubes. And the corner of those cubes would actually would essentially produce the grid. And this was done then by laser cutting stainless steel. The stainless steel parts were then welded together on a kind of pneumatic jig so that as the welds would cool and they would kind of clamp down, you could still eject the box off of the welding jig. They were then ground and powder coated. I think there was something like a mile of continuous welds that were done on these boxes. There were about 420 boxes altogether. And then, although the SOM building went on hold, we finished the art before the building, and we were able to exhibit it for one day in Philadelphia. And here's a shot of it going together, essentially bolts together as a series of larger blocks. And here, kind of view of the front, and here a view of the back, kind of looking at the difference between those two. And what was particularly intriguing about this is the way in which it reads very differently from far away. And from far away, you start to kind of pick up clues about the kind of moments of the view cones passing through. But particularly from the back, it starts to take on much more different characteristics. You start to get this incredible projective geometry on the inside of this thing, which we thought was very intriguing, that one could actually take simply the act of looking at something and use it, kind of index it really, and produce this really kind of fantastic interior space. The only downside to this is that when we did install it, we had a little kid who got his head stuck in there. So we're working on that. But you know, he didn't get his head stuck, but it was stuck in there, and I wish I'd had a photograph of it. It's like, you know, anyways, so. All right. So this is the project that Mike also mentioned, the water proving ground as part of the Rising Currents exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And I trust that Catherine Sievert actually lectured on this and probably gave you better background to this than I'll be able to do. But effectively, this was a very kind of risky undertaking for the Museum of Modern Art. Barry Bergdahl, the curator of architecture and design, took great risks by actually inviting 5 relatively young firms to produce work for an exhibition. And I think it's the first time since 1967 that work was actually produced all of the work in the exhibition was produced for it. So in a sense, they didn't know what they were going to get. And we were also given about 10 weeks to do the work. And the project itself was not exactly, it was a challenging project. Each of the firms was given a site in New York Harbor and asked to rethink the nature of that site relative to the year 2080, relative to the increase of sea level due to global warming. Due to global warming. Our site was on the kind of northwest quadrant of New York Harbor. It's largely underutilized and predominantly what's called Liberty State Park. But there are some monuments that probably are better known to you all: Statue of Liberty, Ellis Island, Central Railroad of New Jersey. And then on the western side, the site is really kind of cut off and defined by the elevated New Jersey Turnpike at this point. And it's a fascinating site in some respects because it's very close to the density of Manhattan, but it's effectively almost like kind of an emerging wilderness. It's a very low-grade brownfield site. Most of it's roped off. You can't get access to it due to the kind of low-grade toxicity. But it's almost the size of Central Park. From a standpoint of its history, it actually is all landfill. It was produced by the Central New Jersey Railroad, who through a series of about 60 years of landfill, filled in this kind of tidal marsh, making it essentially a series of train kind of depots, or essentially part of their train system. The Central New Jersey Railroad Station is where a vast majority of the immigrants from Ellis Island would actually work their way into the country. So this was an incredibly heavily trafficked railroad in its time, but by about 1965 it essentially went out of business, and the site has largely been underutilized since then. Relative to sea level rise, we have a pretty tricky situation in that, given the fact that it's all low landfill, with a conservative 2-foot sea level rise by 2080, 68% of the site will be underwater. With a more kind of aggressive sea level rise due to rapid ice melt of the polar caps, we're looking at about 80% underwater, 4-foot sea level rise. And with the anticipated storm surges that are likely to occur about every 15 years, we're looking at virtually the entire site underwater. So the kind of question is, all right, what do you do? What do you do in this context? And our feeling was, okay, we want to make it possible that this site is available for a variety of public uses. And we also wanted to kind of rethink the very nature of what a park and what an edge of a city could be, and move away from the definition of the city edge being this kind of hard edge, a kind of seawall distinguishing very clearly the difference between water and land, and actually through a series of kind of cut and fill and embracing a kind of gently sloping topography, actually kind of pull the coastline into the land, into the kind of mass of the land, making essentially four kind of large landscape piers of elevated soil. And then developing a kind of series of cross-graining. And that cross-graining then, in a sense, allows us to take a coastline that's currently 5 miles and multiply it by a figure of about 9 or 10, so that we end up with a coastline of 45 miles. And this does a couple of things for us. One is it works much better to actually absorb the energy of storm surges, and it produces a much greater kind of area for us to develop kind of intertidal zones. And that's kind of ultimately one of our real interests, was to look at how one could take the fluctuations between land and water in these intertidal zones and use that as a kind of testing ground for different approaches to both park and landscape. And here the kind of image of it at high tide. At the end of the piers will be located a kind of anchor point from a research and development center, amphitheater, water lodge, and a market. And the way in which we are considering the kind of loose programming, and again, this was done very within the 8-10 weeks, but we wanted to develop a kind of range of uses that would go from research to recreation, from aquaculture to agriculture to leisure, but not seeing the park as a picturesque environment, but something that actually was fluctuating between the productive and the recreational. So here one has a plan of the project, with in a sense, the project developed as a series of what we call petri dishes, and the degree to which these These would be, have hard edges, would have to do with how much remediation they might have to accommodate, or how much fluctuation they would embrace relative to the intertidal zone. One of the tricky aspects of this project was simply representation. We were very interested in the way in which a small variation in section could have dramatic impact in plan, and how do you make that legible? So what we did is develop a kind of projection on an 8-foot model, 8-foot by 8-foot topographically milled model, that then the projection would literally kind of animate the fluctuations from low tide to high tide, and even up to the storm surge. So you could start to see the way in which we were literally thinking about the land and water in a constant dialogue, a constant shift, and that was part of the very nature of thinking of the programming of the space. In addition, we went through a series of perspectives as a way to kind of give a kind of legibility to this possible site, particularly to people who would be attending MoMA who may not be conversant with plans and section and diagrams, and we wanted to kind of give a sense of what we were talking about, what might be possible here. So here's the an aerial view of the Aquaculture Research and Development Center. They would both kind of test different species of plants and animals within the water. The next pier up had a concert venue that was both visible from the land and from boats and barges. And adjacent to that would be a kind of tidal park where islands and pools would appear and disappear with the fluctuations of the tide. Further up was a kind of an aquatic lodge that could be accessible at low tide from Ellis Island, that again kind of emerged out of the water and provided both kind of tidal pools for bathing and also locations for kayaking and other means of getting at and inhabiting the site through not just vehicles but also through boats. And further up at the north, adjacent to the existing train station, we tried to figure out a way that the train station itself could be a kind of central market for the various products and aquaculture and agriculture, including what we thought would be a kind of series of test beds for crops that could grow in different degrees of salination within the site. And in a sense, what we thought about is ways to really use this particular project as a kind of optimistic test case, really, for both conditions that New York will have to deal with, and also, in a sense, many coastal areas around the world. So we're trying to find a way that design isn't simply kind of, isn't simply trying to solve a situation, but actually try to find a way that there's a kind of optimistic possibilities released by what ultimately is a very kind of terrifying potential condition. This is a project returning to an academic setting that we're still under construction on. And it's in Wyoming, which is the antithesis of, when you're in Wyoming, you don't think about rising sea level. And it's actually I love going to Wyoming. It's, it's a fantastic landscape. But we had an interesting problem here in that this is meant to be a student center, and the space we were asked to come in and essentially rework failed to distinguish really between where students would sit within the space and the circulation that would exist around it. So this is a photograph prior to our design of the kind of very large lobby space. And essentially, you couldn't use it as a student lounge. There's no place to kind of inhabit. So we started looking at the possibility of combining a cloister, courtyard, and a picture gallery into using that as a kind of model for this particular project. Imagining ways that we could actually produce a point of stasis within the middle of the space, separating it out from the circulation, but then also deploying a series of photographs around the perimeter of the space so that we could get, again, the kind of picture gallery with the cloister operating simultaneously. And here's a kind of a perspective view of this. And the way this was done was milling many sheets of bamboo plywood. and clipping them onto a series of walnut structures. And the bamboo ply would be porous where it went around the space, but where it went around the core, it would simply be a relief, a kind of relief milling. And this starts to set up very interesting kind of negotiation with the people that'll sit within the space versus the ones circulating, and also set up a kind of resonance between the kind of framing of views that occur on the inside across the bamboo and the various kind of pictures that are kind of lined up around the chair or the kind of rail, the picture rail that lines the perimeter of the circulation. The space is double height with a really wonderful skylight, and so we're actually extending that bamboo up, and the second floor is a similar lounge space within it. But the consequence both of light patterns that go through here, watching people move through, it's really starting to kind of take on some magical qualities. The other thing we wanted to do is try to link these two levels through a kind of branching chandelier, picking up some of the chandelier work we had been doing at Fluff, where the lights would actually start to extend and almost become a ceiling surface. In this particular case, the lights are just kind of fluorescent lights cut into the ceiling, and we're basically deploying kind of resin panels that then glow in particular ways. There's a connection made by the stainless steel between the handrail and the vertical supports that kind of clip the bamboo to it. And it produces really, I mean, these photographs don't quite capture, but there's really great play of light and glow within the acrylic, the resin panels. And finally, below the skylight, there's this 900 square foot area, and the client had worked to try to find an artist who was interested in doing a very large mural or an art piece within this, and they struggled. 2 or 3 really well-known artists. We had to exaggerate the vertical axis of the topography to get a kind of reading of it. But I love the fact that you're going to have something that on the one hand is very recognizable, the topography of Wyoming, but by a slight shift of 90 degrees off of the way in which you normally see it, and the scale at which it's now going to be perceived. So I hope that at some level people come in and they're not actually sure what it is. It seems to just be a kind of bumpy surface. And at the same time, it has extraordinary detail. I mean, detail to every river valley, the mountains, etc. So that oscillation between a kind of an abstraction and hyper-specificity, something that I think is going to be very, very intriguing. And this is hopefully going to be installed next week, assuming nothing goes wrong with the truck. Okay. The final project is a project in Texas that I'm very excited about because we just finished it 3 weeks ago. And we've been working on it for 5 years. It's a contemporary art center in the middle of Austin, Texas. If you know Austin, Texas, this is Congress Avenue. This is the Capitol building. This is 6th Street, which is where a lot of the music venues take place. And we're right on 7th. I mean, it's an absolutely fantastic location. And the building we inherited itself had an amazing history in that it really is 2 different buildings inserted into each other. It was originally built as a theater, as a single space with a stage, a proscenium stage here and a balcony. And here you see a photograph of the theater. And in the 1950s, a department store came in and they got rid of the balcony. They put in a 2nd floor, which you see there. They added the storefront. And they also, to do that, they effectively inserted a steel structure, a kind of concrete and metal deck that rests on a series of steel columns that's literally inserted inside of a concrete frame and steel truss that's the residue of the theater. So you have this kind of nesting, kind of Russian doll of structure, and the evidence of this history is very visible within the project. So the way we approach this is to say, okay, we knew we were working with a tight budget, about $200 a square foot, and so we had to kind of simultaneously solve pragmatic issues and use those as the site for kind of design operations. And since we had design that would be added to this accumulated layer of the building's history. So here's a photograph of the building as we inherited. You see the kind of 1950s awning, and then the kind of space that extends beyond it. And here's a photograph of the design from about a month ago. And one of the key struggles in this project was to take a building whose program and history of programs really didn't want a lot of windows, didn't want a lot of apertures. Department stores, theaters, and galleries don't actually have a lot of windows. And as a result, they had this kind of blank wall down 7th. So the question was, how do we give an image of a contemporary art space within this restriction of not being able to add lots of windows? And so really the kind of argument was to say, all right, could we actually start to animate the surface of this building with a kind of deployment of much more discrete apertures. Apertures that, by being made out of, see that change depending on the light. So the glass that projects out shifts wildly during the course of the day. This is an early morning shot. This is at about 10 o'clock during the day. So the shadows start to shift during the course of the entire day. The other thing that was kind of interesting for us was to say, okay, what happens if we start to cluster these glass blocks, which are about 4-inch wide and 16-inch high, cluster them where we actually need more light and move them away from where we don't. So in a sense, the random, or the appearance of a kind of random pattern is actually kind of telegraphing some of the program inside. So here, where you need more light in the offices, there's a greater density of these glass blocks. In the studios, there's a lot of the glass blocks. But in the galleries, they're much more discrete. But in each of these cases, they're clearly added to the kind of layer, the kind of traces of the layer of the history. So here you see the frescoes from the the theater, the balcony that was severed when the theater was cut out, the second floor from the department store. There are traces of the painting from the department store still visible, but added to that is this kind of pristine kind of stainless steel glass jewel or kind of prism that are added within the space. There were some really interesting consequences that I'd like to say we fully calculated, but I'll be honest, we didn't. One of them is that this absolutely bright noon and 1 o'clock sunlight hitting the glass block, you end up getting these kind of arcs on the floor. And this is because the block itself is actually a lamination of just common half-inch glass that are added up, and the cumulative effect of the bouncing of the light through that actually produces an arc. And this is a photograph. There's no Photoshop here. This is a quick snapshot. When you turn off all the fluorescent lights in the office, the kind of magical light that one has coming through these glass blocks. It was made by a guy with a diamond tip chainsaw. He's a really big guy, kind of intimidating. But what we would do is we would laser cut about 177 chipboard outlines of where we wanted the glass blocks to be. We'd tape them up, photograph them, send it to the structural engineer. He'd say, okay, that's about right. They'd be marked with a Sharpie, and then this guy would come along and cut the hole. It was made possible by the fact that the wall is actually not load-bearing. It's a concrete frame building, and this is essentially a kind of infill of brick and various other substance, such that when we actually cut all these holes, we had to actually go back in and measure each opening because they were all different. And on the inside, we wanted the glass blocks to be flush, but the outside, we wanted them to have various depths. So the glass blocks are almost essentially all unique in all 177 locations. They range from about 12 inches deep to one that's actually almost 3 feet deep because it got located where we were pocketing a curtain for a screening room. These are all illuminated at night by a series of LED lights that are being fed by Cat5 cables, so we could actually embed that cable behind the stucco and didn't have to put it in conduit. So the power is actually running down the Cat5 as well as the data control of it. And here you see a shot of the sleeve with a glass block inserted into the sleeve, the LED kind of device placed on top of it with a Cat5 home run cable to it, and then the stainless steel cover plate that's put over top of this unit. And at night then, these things glow, right? And they can be controlled in different ways, but they really kind of start to animate the facade in very intriguing ways. The other thing you see here is we really liked the 1950s awning, but we felt it could do more. So we started to kind of extend it not just from the glass line out, which is what most awnings do. They tend to really only kind of connect over the sidewalk. We actually wanted to bring it all the way into the space, let it actually be the kind of sign, or I should say be the entry to the building is through the kind of stretched sign of Art House. Here's the kind of perspective study of the way in which that awning is actually brought in and defines and articulates the difference between the kind of entry reception and gives you glimpses of the gallery beyond. And here's the kind of photograph. Just so, you know, that's not too much of a lie. That's pretty good. So But we very much like the way in which the awning really starts to merge the street into the building and vice versa. This was, we also wanted to, again, kind of perforate it. We're very interested in the kind of consequences of perforation. And in this particular case, there are about 250 holes that were drilled in the ceiling. Some of them hold lights, some of them hold speakers, some of them are mounting points, but they give a kind of cadence and start to articulate and connect, again, the outside area with the inside area. The other key component to the entry was this staircase. And the stair for us was a key component because it had to actually, in our mind, it had to actually take people from the sidewalk and give them, almost kind of invite them, much in the same way in which a kind of hand was dropping down, pull them into the main second floor gallery up here. And we wanted to develop a stair that had a bit of humor to it, a stair that was both gravity-based and suspended. It was both heavy and actually the appearance of light, although it's actually not very light at all. The stair treads extend up about 40 feet all the way up to the roof deck and to the skylight up here. And the angle of the slope of the extension of the stair tread matches the slope of the nosing. So in a sense, the nosing of this unit actually defunded down from the roof or from the floors itself. And here it gives you a sense of that space that's produced moving you up into the second floor and even kind of connecting over to the kind of reception desk on the first tread. Up in the second floor gallery, which is really one of the major galleries of the space, we had fantastic existing trusses, the steel trusses when it was the theater, and we wanted to find a way that we could articulate this large space in a way that would both be how do I put this? Both be something that an artist could engage, be a kind of provocation to an artist, but it also could go away. So that oscillation between an architecture that you have to contend with, and at the same time, one that you could actually just make disappear. And what we developed is a very long wall, and that wall it's about 57 feet long, it's 13 feet high. It rolls on a series of tracks and has 2 motors. And what this actually slides along are a series of I-beams that we added, and in fact had to add, to the bottom chord of the trusses because we added a lot more weight to the roof. The trusses weren't strong enough, so the structural engineer said, you've got to add another I-beam to the bottom chord of the truss. We said, great, that's our track. That'll be our track to move this wall back and forth. So one can have one can make this fairly intriguing wall of the kind of layered history that I've been talking about visible by sliding this wall off to the side, or it can produce a kind of Bruce Nauman corridor, a kind of a very restricted gallery space and a kind of larger one. Can split the space in half if you want, or even return to a kind of normative white gallery and simply get rid of all the articulation over here. And actually, it only takes about 30 seconds to go the whole way down the wall. I'm waiting for an artist to smash things between the 2 walls. But I mean, I'm very excited by the possibilities of what people might do with this. The other interesting thing that we started to kind of look at is by adding a kind of roof deck on here, we were able to actually capture a space between the existing roof and the new roof where we could run all of our ducts. So at one point we were having to kill the trusses by having to run all our ducts in here, but we were able to kind of capture space by the flat roof, and therefore all of the this became a huge, big chase space that helped out the project immensely. And finally, the kind of roof deck is a kind of an earned income site. It's within the heart of the city. You can see the Capitol building. You're right on Congress. And it's set up to provide a range of activities, including possibility of a screening, an outdoor screening, and just some details. We're developing ways in which really thought about this roof deck as not just a flat surface, but as actually something that merged into furniture. So here you see the kind of bench that actually starts to fade away as this enclosure shifts into being the kind of screen at the back of the site. And finally, just a couple of photographs of the opening. For us, this was very exciting to watch it both be animated and inform the various events within the building, but also how those are connected to the city and really intensify the life of Austin. Both on the outside, here the slots of glass above the skylight at night are backlit by actually generic rope light, covered in Fresnel lenses, so you don't know they're cheap rope lights. The gallery inhabited with Jason Middlebrook's art, which is all made from recycled parts of the building during its demolition. And then even the kind of lower floor gallery, which during the final opening day was used as a kind of an event party. There's fear of rain, so they moved the samba band down here, and just the kind of exchange between the life of the city, people wondering what the hell's going on from the street, looking in. But just this, I mean, this was a very kind of gratifying moment to kind of see the architecture, the inhabitation of it start to really kind of oscillate with the city in very productive ways. And I'll end there. But thank you very much.